So the whole premise of the executive order is that we're going to stop all refugees and we're going to stop travelers from 7 countries for a few months because we need to overhaul the way that we screen people before they come into the United States. Well, I talked to somebody who does that screening. He's on the staff of the United States Citizen and Immigration Services, USCIS. He's an interviewer, flies to Africa and to the Mideast. He's interviewed applicants from all 7 countries that we have temporarily banned. Sits with people for hours, drilling them on the details of their stories, looking for inconsistencies and lies. He asked that we not use his name or put his voice here on the radio, so I'm going to call him Bob. We have an actor, Scott Shepard, saying what he said here in the air. Bob said that when he and his colleagues heard about the executive order, the reaction was mostly shock and sadness. A few dozen of them went out for drinks together, and some people cried then. Can I ask, did you cry?
On my own, yes. In front of my friends, no.
And so the news came down, this executive order came down. And so what happens to your work? Like, what are you doing now?
When it came down, we basically came to a screeching halt, Most of us were getting on airplanes, and so we just literally had no work to do. So now we're all, most likely it looks like we're going to redeploy to the southern border where we can do credible fear work. I'm not sure if
you mean you'll be doing with the border with Mexico, where you'll be doing credible fear work? That's people who want asylum,
right.
And you have to interview them to figure out if they have a credible fear of getting killed.
Right.
Now, the whole premise for this executive order is that our ways of screening people to come into this country from these particular countries is not strong enough, and we're not doing a good enough job. And the president wants to put in something that he's calling extreme vetting. What do you think of that idea?
I find it personally offensive because it implies that those of us who vet refugees weren't doing extreme vetting before, that the work that I do as a refugee officer wasn't adequate to begin with, and I take the security of our country as my first priority. So I would never let someone in who I was suspicious of.
Bob and I talked for a while about the vetting procedures that are in place now, and they are considerable. People are fingerprinted. We take biometric data. In many countries, there are iris scans. Security checks are run by the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Defense, the National Security Agency, the National Counterterrorism Center, and sometimes others. They look at criminal databases and terrorism watch lists. They check family members' affiliations. They'll call contacts in people's smartphones. They have document verification labs. They compare the biometric information. And, of course, they check people's social media accounts. The interviews Bob does are face-to-face. They take hours. A lawyer that I talked to who advocates for refugees seeking asylum, Laura Finkbeiner from the International Refugee Assistance Project, emphasized how these interviews are customized for each person.
So they have a bunch of screening questions that they've particularly crafted, and they do this based on country. So they know if you're from a certain area at a certain time, there are certain groups active there. So they're checking to see, they're asking you questions that are based specifically on your story, and they're making sure that what you're saying is credible, so it's consistent with what they know about the area at that given time.
And so we are looking for discrepancies in that information.
I asked Bob about this.
Like, why, if those stories don't match, explain to me why not.
And so basically, are you just like running them through like a million little details trying to trip them up?
For the most part, yeah.
I know this has become an incredibly politicized question, but I hope you can answer it honestly. Are there times in your job where you feel like, oh, I really can't tell about this person, and I wish I had more tools. I wish there was more I could do to figure this out better?
There are times that, because it's impossible to know about some people, right, for whatever reason. But that's why we have a process, We're not letting people in that we have question marks about.
Oh, if you're saying if you can't figure it out, then they just don't get in.
Right.
And all this brings us to something that's not just Bob's opinion. Many people believe that the current vetting system is effective. They'll tell you our current system's working. And as for the rare cases where somebody gets through, they'll say no system's perfect. No system can be perfect. We need to study and learn from those cases. One of the people who said the system is effective to me most fiercely this week was Kirk Johnson. He's been on our program before. He worked for USAID in Iraq, and then when he came back to this country, he started the LIST project to help interpreters and other Iraqis and Afghans who worked with the U.S. overseas, whose lives were threatened because of it, move to this country. In that job, he's become very familiar with how hard it can be to get somebody into the U.S., even if they risk their lives helping American troops. He said it's tough.
You know, I'm really in this twilight zone because I'm seeing the President of the United States and his advisors try to draft policy to address a problem that doesn't exist.
And what problem is that?
Well, he campaigned by saying that we're not vetting these people. And the only way you can say that is if you don't know anything about how people are vetted. And so, Trump's a busy guy. I don't expect him to sit down and learn the 2-year vetting process in place by the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. But I sure as hell expect Steve Bannon or Steve Miller or any of the Steves who drafted this thing to just spend a few minutes and find out what is already in place. And I know for a fact that they did not go to the State Department's refugee processing people, the people that have been doing this for decades. They never even got a basic briefing as to what currently exists.
How do you know that they didn't consult with the State Department?
I was on the phone with the State Department minutes before he signed it, asking whether or not these people that I was pushing were going to be able to board a plane that night.
And this is in which office of the State Department?
In the Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau.
And that's who manages these programs to figure out who can come into the country?
Right.
Wait, and so you were on the phone with this person while the signing was happening?
It was about 3 or 4 minutes beforehand. I reached out to this official at the State Department to say what's going to happen when she shows up to the airport, and he didn't know. And I said, how can you not know? Were you not? Haven't they been coming and working this all out with you? And there was silence, and I pushed him, and he said, well, I mean, what do you want me to say? I'm sitting here refreshing the White House website just like you are.
Looking for the text of the executive order.
Right.
We reached out to the person that Kirk talked to at the Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau to confirm this. He hung up on us. Of course, not everybody agrees with Kirk Johnson. We reached out to 2 experts who have questions about how well our current system works. And we asked them what's missing. How can we vet better? Mark Krikorian of the Center for Immigration Studies, which generally argues for less immigration, said we could ask more questions during the vetting process to figure out the ideology of applicants, ask if they agree with American values. But that was the only specific thing that he could point to. Tim Kaine, who heads up immigration studies at the Hoover Institution, not the former vice presidential candidate, had no specific things he thought that we should add to the vetting process. He thinks it's thorough. Instead, he questioned whether we can effectively screen people at all from places like Syria and Somalia.
I don't know if it's possible to vet in a failed state. What do you do to vet people in a failed state where there's no government to serve as a source of documentation? And I think the right answer might be it's impossible.
Mark Krikorian at the Center for Immigration Studies went a little further on the same point.
I mean, we run people's names through the databases that we have, but the state simply doesn't exist in those places. You know, what are we going to do, run somebody's fingerprints through the Mogadishu DMV?
Bob, the interviewer that I talked to at USCIS, says that that's a naive picture of our security databases and the role they play in screening and the kind of information in them. And he said, in fact, Syrians, though they come from a failed state, are among the best documented refugees. They almost always have documentation with them, he said, like these things called family books, which are government-issued documentation of entire families. None of the people we talked to this week could tell us exactly what was meant by the phrase extreme vetting. National security experts say that it's not a term that's been used in their world. Both Kaine at the Hoover Institution and Krikorian at the Center for Immigration Studies said the phrase extreme vetting seems like something that Donald Trump just made up. It's a marketing term, Kaine said. And the moment Donald Trump invented it seems to have been last summer, right after the attack in Nice, France. This is then-candidate Donald Trump on Fox News about 4 hours after the attack. Greta Van Susteren asked him what he'd be doing in this moment if he were president.
Well, it'd be making it very, very hard for people to come into our country, for one thing, from terrorist areas. I would be so extreme in terms of documentation, and Obama's allowing a lot of people to come in. We have no idea who they are. They're from Syria, maybe, but they have no paperwork many times. They don't have documentation proper. I would do extreme vetting. I would call it extreme vetting, too. And,
Do you think the president just doesn't know what he's talking about when he says we need stronger vetting?
I know he doesn't know what he's talking about when he says that.
Again, this is Bob, who works interviewing refugee applicants. He says he thinks most of his coworkers are open to anything that could make the vetting process better. What he has a problem with is stopping the flow of refugees for 4 months while the administration figures it out.
Nobody has a problem with improving the security checks, the process that we have to protect the United States. Nobody's going to be complaining with that. What I do have a problem with is reducing the cap of refugees that we take into the United States in the middle of maybe the greatest humanitarian crisis of my lifetime. The crisis in Syria, it's millions of people that are in need, living in camps around the world. And I feel like this is not the time to shut them out without a valid reason. Me as an American, I feel like this is something we value, that we help the needy, that we stand up to protect people who need protection. And that's something that we're not doing.